My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 33 years old, and 14 years ago, my older brother stood beside me at our grandmother's funeral, pretending to comfort me while secretly hiding a will inside his bank safe deposit box that legally named me as the primary heir to nearly everything she owned. And the worst part is I spent over a decade believing my grandmother abandoned me on purpose because that's exactly what my brother wanted everyone to think. I still remember the smell of lilies inside the funeral chapel in Lexington, Kentucky, the soft sound of people whispering condolences around us, and the way my brother Andrew kept placing his hand on my shoulder like some protective, grieving sibling while quietly controlling every conversation happening around me. At the time, I was 19 years old, emotionally shattered, financially broke, and completely unprepared to lose the only person in my family who had ever truly believed in me, because my grandmother Evelyn Bennett wasn't just a relative to me. She practically raised me after our parents divorced when I was 7, taught me how to study, encouraged my dream of becoming an architect, and spent years telling me repeatedly that one day I would build a life nobody could take away. Before I tell you what happened after her funeral, you need to understand something about my brother because people like Andrew rarely look dangerous from the outside. He wasn't loud, violent, or obviously cruel. He was intelligent, charming, calm under pressure, and incredibly skilled at making selfish decisions sound reasonable, which meant most people trusted him instantly while doubting anyone who questioned him. At 28, he already worked at a regional investment firm downtown, drove a black BMW he absolutely couldn't afford honestly, and carried himself like someone destined for success, while I was the awkward younger sister juggling community college classes with waitressing shifts at a diner off Nicholasville Road, just trying to survive semester by semester. But here's what nobody knew back then, including me. Andrew's financial situation was secretly collapsing long before Grandma Evelyn died. He had gambling debts, failed investments, and thousands of dollars hidden across multiple credit cards. And according to records I wouldn't discover until years later, debt collectors had already begun contacting him privately just weeks before the funeral. The day after Grandma's burial, our family gathered at her old farmhouse outside Georgetown, expecting her attorney to discuss the estate. But Andrew suddenly announced that Grandma apparently never updated her will after Grandpa died, and therefore most assets would automatically transfer through simplified probate procedures connected to our father as next of kin. I remember feeling confused because Grandma constantly talked about planning her estate carefully. Yet Andrew spoke with such confidence that nobody challenged him, especially after he claimed he had already handled conversations with the attorney personally to reduce stress on the family. Looking back now, that was the first major warning sign everyone ignored. Wait until you hear what happened over the following months, because this is where my brother slowly started rewriting our grandmother's memory to protect himself. Almost immediately, Andrew began controlling access to Grandma's belongings, claiming probate restrictions prevented anyone from removing items from the house. But strangely enough, expensive antiques, jewelry pieces, and Grandpa's old coin collection somehow disappeared anyway, while he insisted everything had been cataloged legally. At the same time, he started planting subtle ideas into family conversations, suggesting Grandma worried I was too emotional or financially irresponsible to manage inheritance money wisely, which devastated me because it sounded nothing like the woman who encouraged my ambitions my entire life. My Aunt Denise occasionally looked uncomfortable during those conversations, but like everyone else, she deferred to Andrew because he sounded professional, organized, and informed, while I was still grieving and uncertain. Around that same period, my relationship with my boyfriend Ryan completely collapsed because financial stress forced me to quit school temporarily after losing the small monthly support Grandma secretly gave me for tuition. And suddenly I found myself working double shifts at the diner while struggling to pay rent on a tiny apartment with unreliable heating and mold growing near the bathroom ceiling. I kept waiting for Andrew to help because he inherited what little remained of the estate publicly, including Grandma's farmhouse, her savings accounts, and several investment properties, yet any time I asked simple questions, he accused me of caring more about money than grief. That emotional manipulation worked incredibly well because eventually I stopped asking altogether out of shame. But here's the detail that haunted me most over the years. 3 days before Grandma died in St. Joseph Hospital, she squeezed my hand while struggling to breathe and whispered, "Don't let Andrew take what belongs to you." At 19, I interpreted those words emotionally, assuming she meant memories or family relationships. But 14 years later, I would finally understand she was speaking literally. My grandmother knew exactly what my brother was capable of. Over the next decade, Andrew built the image of a successful, respected financial advisor, while I slowly rebuilt my life from almost nothing, and everyone around us assumed the inheritance situation had been handled fairly, because nobody imagines their own family member would hide a legal will for 14 years just to steal from his sister. But eventually, one forgotten bank document, one retired attorney, and one safe deposit box would expose everything Andrew Bennett spent years protecting. And when the truth finally came out publicly, the consequences destroyed far more than his reputation. The years after my grandmother's death felt like trying to climb uphill while someone quietly kept adding weight to my back, because every time I thought my life was finally stabilizing, another financial setback or emotional reminder of what I lost would hit me unexpectedly. And although I blamed circumstances for a long time, I eventually realized much of that struggle traced back to decisions my brother made immediately after the funeral, while pretending everything was legally and morally fair. At 19, I dropped out of community college halfway through my architecture transfer program because without Grandma Evelyn's monthly tuition support, I simply couldn't afford classes anymore. And I still remember sitting in my academic advisor's office, trying not to cry while explaining I needed a temporary break, even though deep down I feared I might never return. Before I tell you how Andrew tightened control over the family during those years, you need to understand how carefully manipulative people shape narratives because they rarely attack directly in ways others can easily identify. Instead, they slowly influence how everyone perceives the victim, until even reasonable questions sound selfish or irrational. That's exactly what Andrew did to me. Whenever relatives asked why I wasn't continuing school, he'd sigh dramatically and mention how hard inheritance issues can emotionally affect younger people, subtly implying I was bitter over money while presenting himself as the responsible, mature sibling handling complicated adult matters. And because he worked in finance and spoke confidently about legal procedures, people trusted him automatically. Around that same period, Andrew renovated Grandma's farmhouse into a polished modern property complete with expensive landscaping, new hardwood flooring, and custom kitchen renovations that honestly made no financial sense based on the modest estate value he originally described to the family. I noticed the inconsistency immediately because, according to Andrew, Grandma supposedly left behind barely enough liquid assets to cover taxes and maintenance costs. Yet somehow, within 18 months, he was driving a newer Mercedes, taking ski vacations in Colorado, and posting photos online from upscale restaurants in Chicago and Miami. Whenever anyone questioned the sudden lifestyle upgrade, he explained it away as successful investment opportunities through his firm. Looking back now, the arrogance was unbelievable because he genuinely thought nobody would ever investigate further. During those difficult years, the only person who consistently treated me like my concerns mattered was my old high school art teacher, Mrs. Holloway, who occasionally invited me for coffee after learning I left college. And one afternoon in 2014, she told me something that stayed with me for years afterward. She said, "Claire, grief can make intelligent people surrender control to whoever sounds most certain." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant, but later I realized she recognized exactly how vulnerable I became after losing Grandma Evelyn. Meanwhile, my personal life kept collapsing in frustrating ways because financial instability affects everything from relationships to confidence. And by 23, I was working full-time at a furniture warehouse customer service desk while living with two roommates in a cramped apartment outside Louisville, wondering how my life drifted so far from the future my grandmother envisioned for me. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was believing Grandma intentionally chose Andrew over me, despite all the years we spent together. That belief quietly destroyed my self-worth because if the one person who truly knew me decided I wasn't worthy of trust or inheritance, then maybe everyone else was right too. But here's what Andrew never anticipated. Secrets become harder to control over time because eventually people retire, memories resurface, documents get rediscovered, and guilty consciences start cracking under pressure. In late 2015, my Aunt Denise called unexpectedly after several glasses of wine during Thanksgiving weekend and admitted she always found the estate situation strange, especially because Grandma Evelyn repeatedly mentioned updating legal paperwork shortly before her death. According to Denise, Grandma even complained once about Andrew pressuring her financially after several bad investment decisions, though Denise dismissed it at the time as normal family tension. That conversation planted the first real seed of doubt in my mind because suddenly I started questioning details I previously ignored, like why no attorney formally reviewed the will with extended family present, or why Andrew handled every probate conversation. Privately, wait until you hear what happened next, because this was the first moment I realized my brother might have hidden far more than money. In spring 2016, I attended a charity gala through work where I unexpectedly met Daniel Mercer, a former paralegal who once worked for the law office handling estate planning for several wealthy Lexington families, including, unbelievably, my grandmother's attorney, Richard Halpern. During casual conversation, Daniel mentioned Halpern retired years earlier due to health problems, then jokingly added that estate disputes caused more family destruction than divorces sometimes. Something inside me pushed me to mention my grandmother's estate almost instinctively, and the second I said Andrew Bennett's name, Daniel's expression changed slightly before he asked whether probate complications were ever resolved fully. I remember my stomach tightening immediately because his reaction wasn't casual curiosity. It looked more like recognition. Daniel carefully explained he couldn't discuss confidential legal matters, but before leaving, he quietly told me one sentence that completely altered my understanding of the past 14 years. He said, "Sometimes documents disappear because someone benefits from nobody asking questions." I barely slept that night because for the first time, the possibility of deliberate fraud entered my mind seriously instead of emotionally. Over the following months, I began researching probate records online, reviewing public filings connected to Grandma's estate, and comparing timelines against Andrew's financial growth. And the more information I uncovered, the less sense his story made legally. Certain investment properties appeared transferred unusually quickly. Estate inventory documents looked incomplete. Tax filings referenced assets never mentioned publicly to the family. And strangest of all, there was no digitized copy of any final will attached to the probate summary, only references to temporary administrative filings. Deep down, I knew something was wrong by then, but I still underestimated how massive the deception actually was. Because 14 years earlier, while pretending to comfort his grieving younger sister at their grandmother's funeral, Andrew Bennett had already locked away the one document capable of exposing everything inside a bank safe deposit box under his own name. Once suspicion entered my mind, it became impossible to ignore because suddenly every memory involving my brother after Grandma Evelyn's death looked different. Every conversation sounded rehearsed in hindsight, and every emotional guilt trip he used against me started resembling strategy instead of grief. But the frustrating part was that suspicion alone means nothing without evidence. and for nearly 2 years I found myself trapped between instinct and proof while Andrew continued living comfortably inside the reputation he carefully built. By 2017, I finally returned to school part-time through a state transfer program for interior architecture while continuing full-time office work during the day. And honestly, that period nearly broke me physically because my schedule became brutal, leaving home before sunrise, studying during lunch breaks, and falling asleep over drafting assignments past midnight. But something about rebuilding my future independently also awakened a level of determination I didn't have at 19. Before I tell you how I started uncovering real evidence against Andrew, you need to understand why people overlook financial manipulation inside families for so long, because most relatives assume greed looks obvious and aggressive, when in reality it often hides behind responsibility, professionalism, and emotional performance. Andrew never acted like a cartoon villain stealing money openly. He acted like the competent son handling difficult legal responsibilities after a family tragedy, while everyone else stayed emotional and confused. That image protected him for years. Around the same time, my social circle slowly expanded through university classes and work projects, and I became close friends with a woman named Vanessa Cole who studied forensic accounting before joining a regional compliance firm in Louisville. And honestly, meeting Vanessa changed the entire direction of my investigation, because unlike most people, she viewed inconsistencies analytically instead of emotionally. One night after hearing the full story over dinner, she asked me a question nobody else had asked directly before. If your grandmother updated her estate plan recently, where are the attorney billing records? The simplicity of that question stunned me because I had focused entirely on wills and probate filings while ignoring the paper trail surrounding them. Vanessa explained that estate modifications usually generate invoices, notarization logs, witness records, or correspondence, especially for wealthy clients managing property transfers. Suddenly, the entire situation started looking less like family confusion and more like intentional concealment. Over the next year, Vanessa helped me review public business filings connected to Andrew's investment activities, and what we discovered was deeply disturbing. Several months after Grandma Evelyn died, Andrew quietly paid off over $180,000 in personal debt across multiple accounts, while simultaneously purchasing partnership shares in a financial consulting startup that later became highly profitable. Yet according to the estate summary shown publicly to relatives, Grandma supposedly left behind only moderate savings and one partially mortgaged farmhouse. The math simply didn't work anymore. But here's what really shocked me. Buried inside county transfer records, we found references to 2 undeclared investment properties previously owned jointly by Grandma and Grandpa Bennett that disappeared from later estate documentation entirely. Those properties alone were worth several $100,000. I remember staring at the screen in Vanessa's apartment feeling physically nauseous because by then I finally understood something horrifying. My brother didn't just hide money, he likely manipulated the entire estate process from the beginning. Wait until you hear what happened when I finally confronted him privately, because that conversation revealed far more than he intended. In October 2018, Andrew invited me unexpectedly to dinner at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Lexington after months of barely communicating. And the invitation itself felt strange because historically he only contacted me during holidays or family obligations. But Vanessa encouraged me to go anyway because sometimes guilty people reveal more when they think they're still in control. The second I arrived, I noticed Andrew looked older and more tense than usual despite his expensive tailored suit and polished appearance. And after awkward small talk, he suddenly started asking intrusive questions about my finances, school progress, and whether I was finally moving on from old family misunderstandings. The phrasing immediately raised alarms in my mind because nobody says things like that unless they're worried the past might return. Eventually, I asked him directly whether Grandma truly updated her will before dying, and for the first time in my life, I watched my brother genuinely lose composure. His entire posture stiffened instantly. He stopped eating. Then he leaned forward and quietly said something I will never forget. "Claire, some truths cause more damage than they fix." Hearing that sentence felt like ice water running through my chest because innocent people don't respond that way to simple legal questions. I pushed harder, asking about the missing property records and unexplained debt payments. But instead of denying anything clearly, Andrew switched tactics immediately, accusing me of being emotionally obsessed with inheritance because my own life didn't turn out the way I expected. That manipulation almost worked years earlier when I still doubted myself, but by then I recognized the pattern too well. The entire dinner ended with Andrew warning me not to dig around into family matters that could hurt everyone unnecessarily. And as I drove home afterward, I realized something critical. My brother wasn't worried about family conflict. He was terrified of discovery. Over the next 3 years, I quietly continued gathering information while finishing my degree and building a successful design consulting career in Louisville, specializing in commercial interiors. And ironically, the stronger and more independent I became professionally, the more aggressively Andrew tried reestablishing friendly contact through birthday gifts, holiday invitations, and random offers of financial help I never accepted. Looking back now, I think he sensed the balance of power shifting slowly away from him because manipulative people rely heavily on emotional dependency, and once that dependency disappears, their control weakens too. Then, in early 2023, everything changed because retired attorney Richard Halpern died unexpectedly at 78 years old, triggering the transfer of thousands of archived legal documents into storage management under his former law partner's supervision. And hidden inside those archives was one forgotten reference number connected to my grandmother's estate that would eventually lead investigators directly to the safe deposit box Andrew Bennett believed nobody would ever open. When retired attorney Richard Halpern died in February 2023, most people probably viewed it as a quiet local obituary about another aging lawyer passing away after a respectable career. But for me, his death accidentally became the beginning of the end for everything my brother spent 14 years hiding. Because once his legal archives were transferred to his former partner's office for inventory review, old estate files that nobody touched in years suddenly started getting reorganized, digitized, and cross-checked against probate records for compliance purposes. At the time, I had no idea any of this was happening because I was focused almost entirely on expanding my own interior design consulting business after landing a major contract redesigning boutique hotel properties across Kentucky and Tennessee. And honestly, my life finally felt stable for the first time since Grandma Evelyn died. I had a modern apartment downtown, reliable income, close friends, and enough confidence professionally that people actually sought my expertise instead of dismissing me as the struggling younger sibling Andrew always portrayed publicly. Before I tell you about the phone call that changed everything, you need to understand how long-term deception affects your mind, because after enough years pass, even victims start questioning whether uncovering the truth still matters. There were moments by then where I almost convinced myself to stop investigating entirely, because emotionally it felt easier to move forward than reopen old wounds connected to family betrayal and grief. Vanessa disagreed completely. She constantly reminded me that unresolved deception doesn't disappear with time, it simply becomes more profitable for the person benefiting from it. Looking back now, she was absolutely right. Around April 2023, I received an unexpected voicemail from a woman named Margaret Ellis, Senior Records Administrator at Halpern and Brooks Legal Services in Lexington. And initially, I assumed the message was some kind of mistake because she claimed there were irregularities requiring clarification connected to my grandmother's estate records. I remember replaying the voicemail 3 separate times while standing in my office because the wording sounded formal yet strangely cautious, almost like she didn't want to discuss details over the phone. When I returned the call later that afternoon, Margaret explained that during archive restructuring, her staff discovered references to a supplemental estate instruction packet associated with Evelyn Bennett's file. But oddly enough, several key documents listed in the archive index were physically missing from storage despite evidence they once existed. The second she mentioned supplemental estate instructions, my pulse started racing because according to Andrew, there was never any updated will or complex estate documentation whatsoever. But here's the detail that truly changed everything. One archived billing record referenced a secure document transfer authorization tied specifically to a private bank vault under Andrew Bennett's name, less than 48 hours after Grandma Evelyn's funeral. I physically stopped breathing for a second after hearing that sentence because suddenly every suspicion, inconsistency, and manipulation from the past 14 years aligned perfectly into one horrifying possibility. My brother didn't lose the will. He removed it intentionally almost immediately after Grandma died. Wait until you hear what happened when I finally involved investigators because honestly, I underestimated how serious the situation had become legally. Margaret strongly encouraged me to consult probate litigation specialists immediately because according to her preliminary review, several archived notations suggested Richard Halpern privately questioned discrepancies in the estate process shortly before retiring, though declining health apparently prevented him from pursuing formal action. Within days, Vanessa connected me with an estate fraud attorney named Laura Whitaker, a brutally intelligent woman in her 40s who specialized in contested inheritance cases involving concealed assets and fiduciary misconduct. And after reviewing my evidence, she became unusually quiet for several minutes before saying, "Claire, if these records are authentic, your brother may have committed multiple felonies over more than a decade." Hearing the situation described criminally instead of emotionally changed my perspective completely because for years I treated the entire ordeal like painful family conflict, when in reality Andrew potentially orchestrated large-scale fraud involving forged probate disclosures, concealed inheritance documents, and unlawful asset transfers. Laura immediately filed emergency petitions requesting access to surviving archive materials, bank transfer records, and probate amendments connected to Grandma Evelyn's estate, and within weeks, investigators uncovered something even worse than we expected. Multiple large financial movements from estate-controlled accounts occurred during periods where probate authorization technically remained incomplete, meaning Andrew likely accessed restricted assets long before legal distribution approval finalized officially. Around the same time, my Aunt Denise finally admitted another shocking detail she kept hidden out of fear and embarrassment for years. According to her, shortly after Grandma's funeral, she accidentally walked into Andrew's home office while he was arguing on the phone with someone about keeping papers locked away until probate closes permanently. At the time, Denise assumed he meant investment files, but after learning about the archive irregularities, she realized he may have literally referenced the missing will itself. I remember feeling physically sick hearing that, because it confirmed how many opportunities existed over the years for adults around me to question Andrew earlier, yet nobody pushed hard enough. Meanwhile, Andrew started acting increasingly paranoid once legal inquiries began surfacing. He called repeatedly demanding to know why attorneys were reviewing old estate records, accused me of trying to destroy the family publicly, and even attempted contacting my father claiming I was mentally unstable and obsessed with imaginary conspiracies. But unlike 14 years earlier, his tactics no longer worked because facts had started replacing narratives. Then came the moment everything truly collapsed. In August 2023, investigators obtained court authorization connected to the secure document transfer records discovered inside Halpern's archives which led directly to a private safe deposit box maintained under Andrew's sole access authority at Bluegrass Federal Bank in Lexington. According to transaction logs, the box had been opened repeatedly over 14 years, but never closed permanently. When Laura called me after the court order was approved, her voice sounded calmer than usual in a way that almost frightened me because experienced attorneys don't get emotionally invested unless they believe they're about to uncover something significant. She simply said, "Claire, I think we're finally going to find your grandmother's will." And 24 hours later, inside a sealed manila envelope hidden beneath old investment records and property deeds, investigators discovered the original signed document Andrew Bennett spent 14 years concealing from his own sister. The morning investigators opened my brother's safe deposit box felt strangely quiet compared to the emotional chaos I imagined for years, because after spending over a decade doubting myself, questioning memories, and slowly piecing together fragments of deception, I expected some dramatic cinematic moment when the truth finally surfaced. But instead, the reality came through a calm phone call from Laura Whitaker while I sat alone inside my office reviewing hotel renovation sketches, and I remember staring blankly at architectural floor plans while she carefully explained that the original signed will had indeed been recovered exactly where archive records suggested it would be. For several seconds, I genuinely couldn't process the words, because once a lie survives long enough, it starts feeling permanent, even to the person harmed by it. Before I tell you what my grandmother's will actually contained, you need to understand something important, because this is the part that emotionally destroyed me more than the theft itself. Grandma Evelyn knew there was a serious possibility Andrew would try to interfere with her estate plans. That realization changed everything about how I viewed those final months before her death, because suddenly, her warnings, anxiety, and repeated conversations about protecting my future sounded far more urgent in hindsight. According to Laura, the recovered envelope contained not only the original will, but also handwritten notes from Grandma addressed separately to both grandchildren, along with legal correspondence documenting concerns about Andrew's financial instability and gambling problems years earlier. I physically started shaking when Laura mentioned the gambling because although I suspected financial issues before, hearing my grandmother explicitly acknowledge them proved she understood exactly what kind of risk he posed long before the funeral. But here's what completely shattered me emotionally. Inside one sealed letter written directly to me, Grandma apologized repeatedly for believing she still had enough time to protect everything properly before her health declined. She wrote that Andrew pressured her aggressively during her final year to alter investment beneficiaries and property structures, and she specifically warned that he confuses entitlement with love. Reading those words later felt like hearing her voice again after 14 years. The actual terms of the will stunned everyone involved, because Grandma Evelyn didn't simply leave me sentimental items or symbolic inheritance. She named me primary beneficiary over nearly 70% of the estate, including the Georgetown farmhouse, 2 investment properties Andrew concealed from probate filings, multiple long-term savings accounts, and a substantial stock portfolio accumulated quietly over decades through Grandpa Bennett's agricultural supply business investments. Andrew received a smaller but still significant portion conditioned partially on debt counseling and financial oversight recommendations inserted by Richard Halpern after private meetings with Grandma regarding Andrew's gambling behavior. In other words, my brother knew from the very beginning that he wasn't accidentally overlooked or treated unfairly. He deliberately buried the will because it prevented him from controlling the majority of the estate immediately. Wait until you hear what investigators discovered next, because the fraud surrounding the inheritance became even bigger than anyone expected. Once the original will surfaced legally, forensic accountants began re-examining 14 years of estate-related transfers, property sales, investment reallocations, and debt payments connected to Andrew's finances, and what they uncovered was honestly staggering. Several concealed properties had already been refinanced repeatedly to support Andrew's failing investment ventures. Portions of Grandma's stock portfolio were liquidated gradually through shell advisory structures connected to his consulting business. Even worse, one of the investment properties intended for me had been sold years earlier with forged probate certifications attached to transfer paperwork, claiming Andrew possessed sole beneficiary authority. Laura eventually explained that the deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that Andrew spent years using stolen inheritance assets, not just for lifestyle upgrades, but to maintain the illusion of professional success after repeated financial failures privately threatened his reputation. Around that same time, extended family reactions shifted dramatically because relatives who once viewed the situation as sad sibling conflict suddenly realized Andrew orchestrated intentional long-term fraud while emotionally manipulating everyone around him. My Aunt Denise cried hysterically after reading parts of Grandma's handwritten notes because she finally understood why Grandma became increasingly anxious during her final illness. Cousin Melissa admitted she always found Andrew unusually controlling after the funeral, but feared confrontation. Even family friends who admired him professionally started distancing themselves publicly once details leaked through Lexington social circles. Meanwhile, Andrew himself completely unraveled emotionally once court proceedings intensified. He initially denied hiding the will intentionally, claiming he stored documents temporarily during probate confusion and forgot about them over time, which honestly sounded ridiculous considering investigators recovered 14 years of access records, proving he repeatedly opened the safe deposit box while simultaneously managing estate assets inconsistent with public probate filings. Then he shifted strategies again, accusing me of turning private family pain into public humiliation for financial revenge. But unlike the frightened 19-year-old girl he manipulated after Grandma's funeral, I no longer needed emotional approval from him or anyone else. The facts spoke for themselves now. During one especially tense mediation session in Louisville, Andrew finally exploded after Laura presented forensic summaries detailing unauthorized asset transfers tied directly to concealed estate holdings, and in front of attorneys, investigators, and mediators, he shouted something that revealed more truth than he intended. He yelled, "Grandma was always going to choose Claire no matter what I did." The room went completely silent afterward because hidden underneath years of fraud, manipulation, and legal deception was something much uglier: resentment. My brother didn't steal the inheritance purely out of greed. Part of him genuinely hated that Grandma trusted me more than him. And honestly, that realization hurt more than the money because it meant jealousy poisoned our relationship long before the funeral ever happened. But the most devastating moment came later that evening when I sat alone rereading Grandma's handwritten letter and reached the final paragraph where she wrote, "If you are reading this years later instead of immediately after my death, then I was right to fear what Andrew might do." I cried harder that night than I had at her funeral because suddenly I understood the full tragedy of the situation. My grandmother spent her final months trying desperately to protect me from exactly the betrayal that eventually happened anyway. And 14 years later, the truth she feared finally emerged from the same safe deposit box my brother believed would keep his secret buried forever. By the beginning of 2024, the inheritance case stopped looking like a private family dispute entirely and started resembling a full-scale financial fraud investigation because once the original will became admissible in court, every estate transfer connected to Andrew over the previous 14 years suddenly fell under scrutiny from probate auditors, forensic accountants, banking compliance officers, and eventually even state investigators reviewing possible criminal misconduct tied to falsified documents and concealed beneficiary records. Honestly, there were moments during that period where the situation became so overwhelming I struggled to recognize my own life anymore. Because one minute I'd be reviewing commercial design plans for hotel clients, And the next, I'd be sitting inside legal conference rooms, listening to attorneys discuss forged signatures, concealed assets, and unlawful fiduciary transfers connected to my own brother. Before I tell you what happened during the public court hearings, you need to understand how deeply reputation influences people in professional industries, because Andrew spent years building the image of a disciplined financial expert advising clients on responsibility and wealth management while secretly funding parts of his lifestyle through money and property that legally belonged to someone else. Once that contradiction surfaced publicly, the fallout spread far beyond our family. Several longtime clients immediately withdrew investment accounts from his firm after learning about the investigation. Professional licensing boards requested internal reviews, and former co-workers started quietly distancing themselves because nobody wanted their name associated with a growing estate fraud scandal tied to missing inheritance documents. Watching his carefully constructed image unravel felt surreal because for most of my life, Andrew seemed untouchable socially. The confident, successful older brother everyone admired automatically, while I played the emotionally confused younger sister nobody fully believed. But here's the thing: manipulative people never expect. Once evidence replaces perception, public loyalty disappears incredibly fast. Around February 2024, the first major probate hearing took place inside Fayette County Courthouse in Lexington. And I still remember walking through those heavy courtroom doors wearing a navy blazer while reporters and local legal observers whispered quietly around us because by then the story had started spreading through regional media due to the unusual nature of the case. A missing will hidden for 14 years inside a safe deposit box controlled by a financial advisor was exactly the kind of scandal people obsess over publicly because it combined greed, betrayal, inheritance theft, and family deception all in one story. Andrew arrived that morning looking exhausted and noticeably thinner than I'd ever seen him, but even then he still carried himself with that same controlled, polished posture he used his entire adult life, like confidence alone could overpower reality. My father sat beside me during the hearing and quietly admitted he regretted not questioning Andrew harder after Grandma's funeral years earlier, because according to him, deep down, he always sensed something about the estate process felt rushed and strangely secretive. Hearing that confession frustrated me emotionally because so many adults ignored their instincts simply because challenging Andrew felt uncomfortable at the time. Wait until you hear what happened once Laura Whitaker presented Grandma Evelyn's handwritten notes publicly, because that moment changed the entire courtroom atmosphere instantly. Up until then, Andrew's legal team attempted framing the situation as probate confusion exaggerated over time, arguing that grief, paperwork complications, and family tension created misunderstandings rather than intentional fraud. But the second Laura introduced Grandma's personal writings into evidence, everything shifted because suddenly the court wasn't just reviewing financial irregularities anymore. They were hearing the direct voice of an elderly woman predicting her grandson might interfere with her estate plans intentionally. I watched several people inside the courtroom visibly react when Laura read portions aloud, including Grandma's statement that Andrew viewed inheritance as something owed rather than entrusted, and another section where she expressed concern that, if Claire is left vulnerable emotionally after my death, Andrew may exploit that vulnerability. Hearing those words publicly felt almost unreal, because after 14 years of doubting myself, someone finally acknowledged in front of everyone that what happened to me wasn't weakness or paranoia. It was calculated manipulation. Then came the evidence that completely destroyed Andrew's remaining credibility. Banking investigators testified that access logs showed Andrew opened the safe deposit box 27 separate times over 14 years, including periods directly connected to estate property sales and refinancing transactions, making his claim about forgetting the will inside completely impossible to believe logically. Even worse, Metadata recovered from archived probate documents suggested several beneficiary summaries submitted during the original estate process had been modified after creation dates inconsistent with standard filing procedures. In simple terms, investigators believed documents were intentionally altered to conceal the existence of the real will. The courtroom became so silent during portions of that testimony that you could hear people shifting in their seats. But the most shocking moment happened unexpectedly during cross-examination when Andrew's own attorney asked whether financial desperation influenced some of his decisions after Grandma died, clearly hoping to humanize him emotionally instead of portraying him as malicious. And Andrew responded by saying something that revealed far more than intended. He admitted he believed Grandma never respected the sacrifices he made for the family, and claimed she unfairly favored me because I reminded her of Grandpa Bennett's personality more than he did. Suddenly, everything made emotional sense. Underneath the greed was years of resentment, insecurity, and competition that nobody fully recognized while Grandma was alive. Andrew didn't simply want money. He wanted validation. He wanted proof he mattered more. And when Grandma's will contradicted that emotionally, he buried the document instead of accepting her decision. After the hearing, several relatives approached me outside the courthouse, apologizing for believing Andrew for so many years, including Aunt Denise, who admitted she spent over a decade convincing herself staying neutral protected the family from conflict, when in reality it only protected the person causing harm. Meanwhile, media coverage intensified rapidly because local reporters obtained portions of the probate filings and started publishing headlines describing the case as one of Kentucky's most bizarre inheritance disputes in recent years. My phone filled constantly with messages from old classmates, distant relatives, former neighbors, and even strangers sharing their own stories about hidden wills, manipulative siblings, and family betrayals after deaths. It honestly shocked me how common these situations apparently are. But despite everything happening publicly around us, the moment that affected me most came quietly later that night when I returned home and found a package waiting outside my apartment door. Inside was an old framed photograph of me and Grandma Evelyn sitting together on the farmhouse porch when I was about 11 years old. And taped behind the frame was a short, handwritten note in Andrew's handwriting that simply said, "I think she loved you more because you made her feel needed." Reading that sentence made me realize my brother's jealousy started long before inheritance money ever entered the picture. And 14 years of fraud grew out of emotional wounds nobody in our family confronted honestly until it was far too late. By spring 2024, the case against Andrew had expanded so dramatically that people around Lexington started referring to it less as an inheritance dispute and more as the Bennett estate scandal. And honestly, hearing strangers discuss my family like local gossip still felt surreal sometimes because for 14 years I carried the pain privately, believing almost nobody understood what happened. Yet suddenly reporters, attorneys, financial commentators, and even true crime podcasts were analyzing pieces of our lives publicly while debating whether my brother's actions came from greed, resentment, addiction, or some combination of all three. Meanwhile, the emotional strain inside the family became unbearable because once hidden truths surface, old memories start changing shape for everyone involved. Relatives revisited conversations they ignored years earlier. Family friends remembered strange comments Andrew made after Grandma's funeral. Even former employees from his investment firm quietly admitted he often obsessed over fairness, status, and proving himself successful compared to others. Before I tell you about the final confrontation between my brother and me, you need to understand something important, because this became the hardest lesson of the entire situation. Exposing the truth does not automatically erase emotional attachment to the person who hurt you. Despite everything Andrew did, part of me still remembered the older brother who taught me to ride a bike, defended me from bullies in elementary school, and stayed awake with me the night our parents divorced while we both cried quietly in Grandma's guest room. That contradiction made the legal battle emotionally exhausting because every horrifying discovery existed beside real childhood memories that once felt safe and genuine. During those months, I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Elaine Foster after Laura gently suggested I needed support beyond legal strategy. And honestly, therapy forced me to confront something uncomfortable. For years, I unconsciously accepted smaller forms of emotional manipulation from people because growing up beside Andrew normalized the idea that love always came mixed with guilt, control, or competition. Realizing that changed how I viewed almost every relationship in my life. Around the same period, Andrew's professional collapse accelerated rapidly after state regulators suspended portions of his financial advisory licenses pending investigation outcomes. And according to mutual acquaintances, several longtime clients filed independent civil complaints after reviewing questionable investment recommendations connected to his firm. The pressure clearly started destroying him mentally because he became increasingly isolated socially, stopped attending extended family gatherings completely, and according to Aunt Denise, barely left his Lexington condo outside legal meetings and court appearances. But here's what none of us expected. About 3 weeks before the final probate settlement hearing, Andrew contacted me directly asking to meet alone at Grandma Evelyn's old farmhouse for one honest conversation without attorneys or reporters. Every rational instinct told me refusing would be smarter, but emotionally, I needed closure more than caution by then. So one rainy Saturday afternoon in May, I drove out to Georgetown for the first time in nearly a year. Seeing the farmhouse again after everything felt overwhelming because despite renovations and legal disputes, pieces of Grandma still existed everywhere, from the wind chimes hanging near the porch to the smell of old cedar inside the hallway closet. Andrew was already sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived, looking exhausted in a way I'd never seen before, not polished or composed anymore, just tired. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly admitted something I never expected to hear from him. He said he originally intended to hide the will only temporarily until he fixed his financial problems after Grandma died because debt collectors and gambling losses had spiraled out of control faster than anyone realized. But once he started using estate assets successfully and nobody questioned him publicly, returning the will years later became impossible without destroying his entire life. Hearing that explanation made me realize how many catastrophic decisions begin with temporary selfishness people convince themselves they'll correct later. But then Andrew said something even more painful. He admitted part of him genuinely believed Grandma valued me more emotionally because, unlike him, I made her feel calm instead of disappointed. According to Andrew, Grandpa Bennett constantly praised my creativity and kindness growing up while criticizing Andrew's arrogance and risk-taking behavior, and after Grandpa died, Andrew became obsessed with proving himself successful enough to finally earn the same admiration from Grandma. Suddenly, the entire tragedy looked different to me because underneath the fraud and manipulation was a deeply insecure man who confused inheritance with emotional worth. Wait until you hear what happened moments later, because this was the first time in 14 years my brother stopped lying completely. After nearly 2 hours of conversation, Andrew walked upstairs silently before returning with a small wooden box I recognized instantly from Grandma's bedroom dresser years ago. Inside were old family photographs, handwritten birthday cards, and several unopened letters addressed separately to both of us that Grandma apparently wrote before her final hospitalization, but never mailed. My hands shook opening mine because the first sentence immediately destroyed me emotionally. Grandma wrote, "Claire, loving one grandchild more than another would mean I failed both of you." I looked up after reading that line and saw Andrew crying quietly across the kitchen for the first time in my entire life. Then he admitted the truth neither lawyers nor investigators fully uncovered yet. During the weeks after Grandma's funeral, he repeatedly opened the safe deposit box intending to return the will, but stopped every time because the inheritance money temporarily solved another financial crisis, another debt, another failing investment, another image problem, until eventually the lie became too large to undo without losing everything publicly. In other words, my brother trapped himself inside his own deception year after year, while convincing himself there would always be another opportunity to fix it later. By the time the truth finally surfaced 14 years afterward, he wasn't protecting money anymore. He was protecting the false identity built on top of stolen trust. As I prepared to leave that afternoon, Andrew stopped me near the porch and quietly said, "You know the worst part? Grandma was right about you. You really did build a life nobody could take away." And standing there while rain hit the farmhouse roof around us, I realized something heartbreaking. My brother spent 14 years stealing property, money, and opportunities from me. Yet the one thing he truly wanted all along was something inheritance could never buy: feeling genuinely loved without needing to compete for it. The final settlement hearing took place in July 2024 inside a packed Lexington courtroom filled with attorneys, reporters, extended relatives, and curious observers who followed the case for months, and sitting there beside Laura Whitaker while waiting for proceedings to begin felt strangely calm compared to the fear and confusion I carried 14 years earlier, because for the first time since Grandma Evelyn died, I no longer doubted myself, questioned my memories, or needed anyone else to validate what happened. The evidence already spoke clearly enough. My brother concealed a legal will, manipulated probate processes, misused estate assets, and built an entire version of his life around a deception he kept postponing fixing until the lie became too massive to survive exposure. Before I tell you how everything ended, you need to understand something important, because this became the biggest realization of my entire journey. Stolen inheritance wasn't the deepest damage Andrew caused. The real theft was psychological. For 14 years, I believed the one person who loved me most chose someone else over me. And that belief quietly shaped every relationship, decision, insecurity, and fear I carried into adulthood. No financial settlement could fully return those lost years. During the hearing, the judge approved major corrective estate restructuring based on the recovered will, reversed several fraudulent property transfers, and ordered substantial financial restitution tied to concealed assets and unauthorized estate gains accumulated through Andrew's actions. Criminal penalties connected to document concealment and probate misconduct remained under separate review afterward, but professionally, Andrew's career was already effectively destroyed because no serious financial institution would trust an advisor publicly exposed for hiding his grandmother's will in a safe deposit box for 14 years. Watching the final legal orders get entered into record felt surreal because for so long, the truth existed only as fragmented suspicion inside my head. Yet now, every deception sat documented formally in court transcripts and verified evidence. But honestly, the moment that affected me most happened after proceedings ended, when several reporters crowded outside the courthouse expecting dramatic, emotional statements about revenge, greed, and betrayal. And instead, I found myself thinking about Grandma Evelyn sitting on her farmhouse porch years earlier, telling me repeatedly that bitterness eventually consumes the person carrying it. So when journalists asked whether I hated my brother after everything, I answered truthfully. I told them anger kept me alive emotionally for a long time, but eventually surviving required something different. It required refusing to let someone else's dishonesty define my identity forever. Around that same period, my life changed in ways I never expected because once the case concluded, opportunities connected to the restored inheritance allowed me to expand my design business nationally, restore Grandma's farmhouse properly instead of selling it, and create scholarship funding for architecture students from low-income backgrounds through a memorial program in her name. Honestly, that project meant more to me than the financial recovery itself, because for the first time, I felt like Grandma's belief in me finally reached the future she always imagined, instead of getting buried beside her. My relationship with family also shifted permanently afterward. Aunt Denise became one of my closest relatives because she stopped avoiding difficult truths and started rebuilding trust honestly through actions instead of apologies alone. My father admitted repeatedly that the case forced him to confront how easily families sacrifice truth to preserve temporary peace. Even cousins who once stayed distant gradually returned once the manipulation and confusion surrounding Andrew disappeared publicly. But the relationship everyone always asks about is Andrew. The truth is complicated. We didn't magically repair 14 years of betrayal after one emotional conversation at the farmhouse. Trust doesn't work that way. For several months after the hearings, we barely spoke beyond occasional updates through attorneys and family logistics. Then around Thanksgiving 2024, Andrew voluntarily entered a long-term addiction and behavioral treatment program specializing in gambling dependency and compulsive financial behavior after finally admitting his problems existed long before Grandma died. According to Dr. Foster, genuine accountability only begins once people stop protecting the image of themselves they desperately want others to believe. Maybe for the first time in his life, Andrew finally reached that point. A few months later, he sent me a handwritten letter instead of another emotional speech or excuse, and inside he admitted something painfully simple. Every year he kept the will hidden became harder emotionally, but also easier practically because by then his entire identity depended on maintaining the lie. That sentence stayed with me because it explained so much about human behavior in general. People rarely destroy their lives all at once. They do it gradually through repeated, smaller compromises they convince themselves are temporary. Looking back now at 19-year-old Claire sitting devastated after Grandma's funeral, believing she had been forgotten, I wish I could tell her one thing clearly. Sometimes the people who betray you work very hard to make you feel unworthy, because if you ever recognized your real value, their control over you would collapse immediately. My brother spent 14 years hiding a will, but he also spent 14 years trying to bury the confidence and future Grandma Evelyn believed I deserved. In the end, he failed at both. The farmhouse still stands outside Georgetown with Grandma's wind chimes hanging near the porch exactly where she left them. And some evenings, I sit there reading her old letters while thinking about how differently life might have unfolded if the truth surfaced earlier. But maybe that's the final lesson in all of this. Justice delayed still matters. Truth buried still exists. And eventually, no matter how carefully someone locks away evidence inside vaults, safe deposit boxes, or lies repeated for years, reality has a way of resurfacing when people finally choose courage over silence. So now I want to ask you something. If you discovered a family member stole your future while pretending to protect the family, would you fight publicly for the truth even if it destroyed them socially? Or would you stay quiet to keep peace? Let me know in the comments because honestly, I think many people underestimate how much damage hidden family resentment can create over time. And if this story moved you in any way, subscribe for more emotional family drama stories about betrayal, survival, hidden secrets, inheritance battles, and rebuilding your life after the people closest to you break your trust. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't ruining someone's life. It's refusing to let them ruin yours.